Okay, I've just come off a lengthy debate thread, um, and I thought the subject matter would make for a good video. So basically, the debate thread was around a photograph showing a little girl. She must be about 7 or 8 years old, max. She might even be younger than that. Um, in front of three male gimps in what are supposedly dog outfits. Well, they're wearing little dog masks, but they're in leather. They're gimps, right? Um, and the debate was about whether or not this was inappropriate around children. Now, there's a few important disclaimers before I continue. I don't want anyone to think I'm talking about this being representative of Pride events in general. It was in a Pride event. The location wasn't mentioned. I believe I saw one of these before, and it was somewhere in South America. I think it was Sao Paulo, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Um, in a way, regardless of where it is, that certainly doesn't represent all Pride events. Um, as I understand it, most Pride events don't have children around gimps. That's not the thing. Nevertheless, I do feel that a lot of Pride events have overt sexuality on display. I think that's irrefutable. It's just a fact. Now, what this thread was about was, is this inappropriate for children? And was me and another person were arguing that it isn't, and there was two people debating with us who were arguing that it was harmless. Now, one of them said the little girl doesn't know that there's sexual connotations, therefore it's harmless. Well, a child could look at white powder that's cocaine powder and think it's just sugar, right? What a child perceives has no relevance to adult responsibility. And in my view, children should not be around gimps. That's just common sense. And what bugs me about things like this is some people have this automatic knee jerk reaction that if you criticize it, you're some sort of religious nut or a homophobe. I know of gay men who don't approve of this precisely because they think it harms the overall image of Pride events. And it's not representative of Pride events. You know, most Pride events don't have things like this, but the point is, if it's perceived as okay, if there isn't criticism of it, then at some point it is going to, be tied in with the wider representation of Pride. I have a big problem with this silencing by certain members of the LGBT community to try and smear anyone that disagrees with them as hateful homophobes. It's a really smearing someone as a homophobe, a racist, or a sexist, those three things, it's a really, in my view, underhand way of trying to win an argument because you're putting the other person, you're vilifying the other person in a way that whatever they say, no matter how truthful, no matter how accurate, no matter how reasonable, you've smeared them. And so it's very easy to portray, oh, well, that's just a homophobe speaking. It really pisses me off because I think just a lot of common sense goes out the window with this. I mean, my own take on it is I would have no problem with children learning about different sexual orientations. In fact, I think that's important in order that they get a tolerant attitude to wider society. I think that's totally reasonable. Telling children, for example, some boys like boys, some girls like girls, etc. But a gimp suit, I mean, is the world gone upside down that this is now deemed to be totally harmless? The point I would make is some people say, oh, well, we see it with straight people all the time. Not necessarily. I would contend the music industry is overly sexualized, very much so. If you compare, for example, pop videos from the 80s, even the early 90s, to today, you just have to channel hop on a music station and you'll see pretty much every other video is frankly some diva um, wearing barely any clothes, twerking, or some male equivalent, some guy. It probably is more with women, but you see it on both sides. And so I do think the music industry is overly sexualized. And I hate this idea that if you take issue with any of that, then you're a prude, you're a Puritan. Look, I'm a I'm a straight man. I like a sexy girl as much as the next guy. But I do think when it's overly reliant on that, then it's just obvious that they're using sex to sell. Now, regarding gimp suits around children, I wouldn't have thought it needed to be spelled out why that is inappropriate. Um, the contention that our two adversaries were making in this thread were, oh, well, the child doesn't know it's a sexual connotation, therefore it's harmless. But the point is, the adults do. And they were trying to make out, oh, it's just a dog suit. Rubbish. There's a fundamental dishonesty in that. I mean, I guess it's better if you saw the thread. I'm just talking about this from my perspective. But it's fundamentally disingenuous then to say, oh, well, there's no sexual innuendo there when there clearly is. Now, there is a controversial point I want to raise, and I want to be very clear how I talk about this because I don't want to be misunderstood. Let's be clear, predatory behavior is not a domain of any sexual orientation, of one sexual orientation. You get straight predators, you get gay predators, you know? So that's that's obvious. I mean, you get a straight predator, or a straight sexual deviant, someone like Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, who targeted women, and then you get others like Dennis Nelson or Jeffrey Dahmer, who targeted young men, boys. So that is not something that can be tied to one sexual orientation. And those who automatically associate gay men with pedophiles, that is plain homophobia. You know, I feel angry at that claim because it is a very inflammatory and inaccurate thing to say. I mean, gay men are as outraged as pedophiles as much as anyone else. So that is a blatantly homophobic insinuation to make. But I do think that in the ever branching out umbrella of the LGBTQ plus IA movement, it's not a push to say that there will be, for example, paedophile rights movements that hijack it, and they could be gay or straight. But they'll say, oh, well, we're just an alternative lifestyle. You know, that's not inconceivable. That at some point in the near future, there will be serious attempts to infiltrate the movement. And this is why it's reasonable to have free discussion about what's appropriate and what isn't. Now, I mentioned it's not true that straight people can just do what they want. If a straight man and if a straight couple were to have sex in a public street, or even, for example, bondage or something that is indicating sexual innuendo, there's a chance that they would be fined for public indecency, right? So the argument of straight people could do what they want isn't entirely true. If I want to, frankly, masturbate in a public shopping centre, I would be arrested, and rightly so. Rightly so. So there are more extreme sexual depictions and pride events that I think need to be challenged because they're in public places at daytime. And I just find it staggering that anyone would need explain to them why it's inappropriate for a little girl to see grown men in gimp outfits. You can still teach the little girl about tolerance. You can teach her there's different lifestyle choices. But if you're okay with that, then you're essentially okay with a child watching porn. I don't think you can say there's that much difference because the gimp outfits have blatant sexual overtones. It may not be hard porn, but it's sexual. It is. And anyone who says it isn't is just being disingenuous. So I do think there is a problem here in that anyone who has a different point of view, anyone who challenges this sort of thing, is immediately vilified as a hateful bigot. One point I would add though, I can understand the LGBT movement being irritated and angry with religious hypocrisy. So, for example, in Islam, in parts of the Islamic world, you have old men literally marrying young girls, which is clearly wrong. So, I would agree with that, that there is hypocrisy there of certain religious moralists getting into this. But speaking for myself, I'm not particularly religious. I don't follow any organized religion. I just think that what is going on in the world where people need it spelled out to them why a gimp outfit with clear sexual innuendo is okay around children. I think this is where Western liberalism is going to get a negative image because totalitarian states like Russia and to a lesser extent China um, will look at this sort of thing going on in the West and they say, oh, well, that's Western liberalism. Anyone could do anything they want. But societies have rules, and that's the way society has always functioned. So I really have a problem with this idea that if you take issue with that, it must mean you're a bigot. Maybe it just means you have certain standards that you think certain things are inappropriate for children. And to me, it doesn't matter if the Gimps are gay or straight. They could have a female dominatrix. I'd still say it's inappropriate. So this really needs to be candidly discussed without people being smeared. The problem with smearing people is, particularly if they're public figures or if, for example, politicians or other public figures, and they're, say, let's just say for the sake of argument, a pride event came to a city and the mayor had a similar view to me. Would that mayor then be labelled a homophobe and be forced from office? That, I think, is wrong. I think, I mean, the whole basis of Pride is to have a place where LGBT people can be themselves and not fear discrimination, beatings, and so on. But I think by an overt focus on sexuality rather than sexual orientation, and there is a difference, it it does give that aspect of the movement a negative image because a lot of more conservative people look at Pride events and they think, oh, well, that's just LGBT people in leather spanking each other and, throwing dildos around and stuff. And that isn't actually what Pride events involve. But that's, if things like this are deemed to be okay, if there's no internal criticism, then you can't really complain if the movement gets a bad image. And you can't just dismiss it as, oh, well, it's religious extremists or homophobes. No, not at all. Um, It's just like you get this with a lot of movements. It's like if you criticize feminism, third wave feminism, oh well, you must be against women's rights. You don't like women in power. Rubbish. I take the view that no movement is above criticism. None. Period. So let me know your thoughts. I think Pride organizers need to be responsible. I think they need to know that these events are taking place at daytime in city centres. And overt sexual displays, in my opinion, should be restricted to the nighttime segment. Just like we have a watershed. I don't really see a difference. And then the daytime part can be just like expressions of sexuality or expressions of sexual orientation, I should say, as opposed to sexual acts. And to those who say, oh, well, you're straight, what about straight people doing this, that, and the other? Well, I've already talked about the music industry. That's often involving presumably straight stars who are overtly sexual, and I think that's inappropriate. I think it's, well, not inappropriate for an adult like myself, but it's just a bit too obvious. It's like they're desperately trying to get views by showing breasts and leg. I mean, it's just, my God, I'm just talking about common sense here. And I know I'm not the only one. Let me know your thoughts.